Have you ever actually stopped to wonder how we study the messy, completely invisible workings of the human mind? I mean, how on earth do psychologists take something as abstract, as hidden, and as endlessly complex as human thought and somehow turn it into rigorous, measurable science? It's a genuinely fascinating question, and, well, we are about to embark on exactly that investigation in our explainer today.
There's this great quote from Gautam Buddha. He noted that an idea developed and put into action is far more important than an idea that exists only as an idea. And honestly, in psychology, that is absolutely our starting point. It's never just about sitting around philosophizing about human nature. It's about taking those abstract, sometimes totally wild theories and putting them into actionable, systematic research. We have to turn those ideas into observable data.
So, welcome to the explainer. Today, we're literally peering behind the curtain to see how human behavior is actually decoded. We'll be looking directly at the methods of enquiry in psychology. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how researchers design their studies, gather their information, and draw real conclusions without ever relying on mere guesswork.
Okay, let's dive into this chapter's roadmap. It's broken down into a logical three-part structure. First, Act 1, the why, which is our blueprint. Then Act 2, the how, our toolkit, and finally Act 3, the rules, which covers our research boundaries. Let's kick things off with Act 1, the why, the blueprint of psychological inquiry. We're starting right at the foundation here. So psychologists basically have 5 primary goals that flow together to hack the scientific method. First up, they need description. That means accurately defining a behavior, like identifying exactly what a stress response looks like. Second is prediction. Once we describe the stress, we can actually forecast when it's going to happen next. Third, explanation. Finding the underlying cause, or, why that stress happens in the first place. Fourth is control, and that's using our knowledge to make a behavior happen, reduce it, or even enhance it, maybe through therapy. And finally, application, because ultimately the whole point is to take all that knowledge and apply it globally to solve real-world problems and bring out positive, objective changes in people's lives. Now, let's move forward and see how this builds. To achieve those 5 goals, researchers have to follow specific, testable steps. It starts with conceptualizing a problem and forming a tentative hypothesis. Then they move on to collecting data, basically designing a blueprint for who they'll study and how. Next, they draw conclusions using statistical methods just to see if their hypothesis actually holds up. And finally, revising research conclusions. The really crucial point here is that science is a continuous loop. If the data doesn't fit, the theory gets revised and tested all over again. But as you know, human experience is incredibly complex. That means not all research looks identical. For a long time, the strict scientific paradigm totally dominated, focusing solely on objective, observable, and measurable behavior, kind of treating humans a bit like subjects in physics. But imagine trying to put a number on the grief of an earthquake survivor. Objective measurement isn't just difficult there, it completely misses the point. And that's where the interpretive paradigm steps in. It seeks subjective understanding over strict prediction. It explores how people make sense of unique events in their own natural flow, without the researcher disturbing them. Both of these are absolutely vital lenses for understanding the mind. All right, moving right along to Act 2, the how. This is our psychological toolkit.
So psychologists collect a pretty massive variety of data. We're talking demographic information like age and gender, physical data like ecological conditions and housing, physiological data, think heart rate or brain activity, and of course, psychological data, tracking intelligence, emotions, or values. But there is a massive caveat here, and it's super important. Data does not exist in a vacuum. It is always, always tied to a physical or social context. I mean, you behave very differently alone in your room than you do in a crowded elevator, right? The data has to reflect that context.
Now, to truly understand cause and effect within all that data, psychologists use the experimental method, and this relies entirely on manipulating variables. Think of the independent variable as the dial the researcher gets to turn. It's the factor that is deliberately manipulated, altered, or varied just to observe an effect. For example, if a researcher wants to know how studying affects grades, the amount of study time, that is our dial. And if the independent variable is the dial we turn, well, the dependent variable is the needle that moved in response. This is the phenomenon the researcher actually desires to explain. It's expected to change as a direct result of turning that independent variable dial. Going back to our example, the student's academic achievement, their actual test score, that is the dependent variable. It depends entirely on the study time. To actually prove this relationship, researchers divide their participants. The experimental group is exposed to that independent variable manipulation. They get the dial turned up. Meanwhile, the control group is treated in every way exactly like the experimental group, but that manipulated variable is completely absent. By comparing the two side by side, researchers can pinpoint precise cause and effect relationships while keeping all other extraneous variables strictly controlled. Because let's be real, you can't accurately measure study focus if a roommate is blending a smoothie in the background. But hey, experiments aren't the only tools we have in the kit. Want to just watch? You can use the observational method to systematically view behavior in either a natural or controlled setting. Want to find associations between behaviors to make predictions without actually changing anything? Use correlational research. Need to understand broad attitudes? Survey research uses interviews and questionnaires. Trying to measure standardized individual differences, like intelligence? That's where psychological testing comes in. Or if you need a really deep, intensive narrative of just a single person's experience, the case study is your go-to lens. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what happens once the data is actually gathered. Researchers face this fascinating philosophical choice. Do we reduce human behavior to hard numbers, or do we embrace the messy narrative of a person's own words? The quantitative method converts attributes into numbers using scaled forms and closed-ended questions to generate aggregate numerical scores for statistical analysis. The qualitative method, on the flip side, embraces the descriptive. It uses things like field notes, open interviews, and participant observation to build thematic content analysis. Which brings us to our final section, Act 3, the rules, the boundaries of research. First off, we have to ground the science by acknowledging its flaws and limitations. Unlike the physical sciences, psychology lacks an absolute 0 point. Think about it. If you measure the length of a table, 0 literally means 0 length. But in psychology, there is no absolute 0 for traits like intelligence or anxiety. Because of this, psychological tools are inherently relative in nature. Add in the subjective interpretation that's required for qualitative data, and you can quickly see just how challenging it is to measure the incredibly nuanced human condition. And because we are studying real people with real lives, there are non-negotiable boundaries. The crucial point is that these aren't just arbitrary rules. They represent the moral duty researchers owe to the humans brave enough to participate. Researchers absolutely must follow vital ethical guidelines. This means ensuring respect for voluntary participation and choice. It requires beneficence, which means protecting participants from harm and maximizing benefits. Researchers also have a strict duty to share the results of the study back with the participants. And above all, they must maintain strict confidentiality of their data sources to protect everyone's privacy. So we've covered the why, the how, and the rules of psychological inquiry. It is a complex, rigorous process that transforms our abstract thoughts into tangible, measurable data. So armed with this entire scientific toolkit, I'll leave you with this question. Looking at the people around you, or hey, even your own behavior, what psychological phenomena would you choose to investigate? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mind.